Welcome back to Proxim, everybody, and today we're going to be looking at the Craftworld Eldar datasheets for 10th edition that have been revealed in the GW demo game. And what I can say is, I was a little bit apprehensive at first, but now I can fully say that I think we're going to be in a strong position come 10th edition, which is good for a lot of us out there that enjoy Eldar. Now, there are a few changes, obviously, that we can now confirm overall, just looking at the trends of the datasheets and also just the fact that there's been so many released. And one of them is that psychic powers are not going to be customized. A lot of us had this feeling going into 10th edition that this was going to happen, and it's confirmed now, right? Psychic powers do not get to be switched out. Every single psyker has a specific power that is on their datasheet, and if you want that power, you're going to have to get that psyker. So Farseer SkyRunner, Farseer on foot, and Eldrad all have different psychic powers that they can use, in addition to their regular special abilities. Eldrad did get revealed, by the way, and I'm very excited to talk about Eldrad today. He's one of the coolest models, and he was actually my first HQ choice for Eldar, so he holds a special place in my heart, and I always hope that he's good every edition. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into it and start talking about the datasheets and analyzing them for 10th edition. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at today in this video. We're going to be taking a look at all the datasheets revealed at the GW demo game. There may be some that I missed. If there are, let me know. And if you can send a screenshot to me or something like that, that would be awesome. Special thanks to some of my subscribers who have emailed me the screenshots from the demo game. I appreciate that greatly. I will give you guys credit in the description so that everybody knows what a help you've been to the channel. And lastly, we're going to be doing a full analysis of the units and possible synergies and combos, which I will talk about as we go through the datasheets. Now, I haven't yet looked at any content creators or anybody for that matters opinions on the units, except for things here and there which I've heard through text of my own gaming group and stuff like that. My buddy who plays Uthway has been texting up a storm about these things, and we've been talking a little bit about that, but I haven't really looked at anybody else's opinions or ideas on the release. So these are 100% my thoughts. They're unadulterated and unfiltered. Okay, starting with one of the first reveals, we have the Farseer SkyRunner. So looking at its stats, movement 14, looks like all jet bike units and skimmer units got reduced by 2 inches of movement from 16 to 14. That's okay. Toughness 4, save 3 plus, 5 wounds. Leadership 6, objective control 2. So it looks like also all jet bike units are getting objective control 2, which is really cool. And I suppose it has something to do with their mounted keyword, which I'm sure other armies will get as well. And I'm sure they'll also get OC too, which makes sense. They occupy a little bit more extra board space, so it makes sense that they would have that to make up for it a little bit. So looking at the weapons, obviously we have Eldritch Storm, which is the same as the Foot Farseer. We have the Shuriken Pistol, Singing Spear, and Twin Shuriken Catapult. It's important to note that the Farseer SkyRunner's ranged weapons are at -1 ballistic skill for some reason. I'm not quite sure why this is. I have to be completely honest because the Foot Farseer has a 2+, but I suspect it's because he's on a jet bike and he's moving very fast, and it might be hard to, I don't know, aim or something like that while on a jet bike. So he does have -1 ballistic skill from what he had before. Not too big of a deal, seeing as you're probably not going to be shooting with him and his ranged weapons that much, except for Eldritch Storm, which hits on the same amount anyway. So that's all well and good there. Just like the Foot Farseer, his Singing Spear and Witchblade are pretty pathetic. Witchblades, obviously, are probably the better choice for combat now, while Singing Spear does give a 12-inch shooting attack, which is not bad, but it's nothing great. Hopefully, they're the same amount of points, 0, which is what they should be, so that, you basically don't have to pay extra points for the Witchblade if you wanted to take it. As for its special abilities, it has Branching Fates, just like the Foot Farseer, same exact thing. So you basically get to change a fate dice to a 6 with, when targeting a unit within 12 of the Farseer. And as long awaited, the Farseer SkyRunner has Guide, which allows you to target a unit within 12 and reroll all hits, which is fantastic. Also comes with a 4+ invulnerable save. And lastly, as a leader, he can only join 2 different units, the Warlock SkyRunner Conclave and the Wind Rider. So unfortunately, he can't join Shroud Runners, which I was kind of hoping he could, to be honest with you, because that, I think, would be awesome. So Shroud Runners look to be probably loners, which kind of makes sense, to be honest, as being outcasts. and Wind Riders, which I assume will be the primary pick for a bodyguard for the Farseer. So overall, the SkyRunner is looking very good, especially when accompanying Wind Riders with Shuriken Cannons. This is the first thing I thought about when I saw this. Guide with Shuriken Cannons. Just think about it for a second. You're hitting on 3s, you're getting sustained hits 1, which means every 6 gets to basically turn into another auto 6 to hit, which is pretty awesome. And you have Guide. So you're re-rolling all your misses, and you can honestly, if you wanted to, it's a little risky, but you could fish a bit for 6s as well. So if you didn't get a lot of 6s the first time, but you're confident that you'll hit on a 3+, you can just re-roll all your hits as well. There's nothing stopping you from doing that to fish for those 6s. Again, might be a little risky. Sometimes I just don't do it. To be honest with you, I just take the flat damage, but it is something you could do to multiply your damage if you really needed something to die. And again, Guide is a great damage multiplier against pretty much anything. A unit of 5 Shroud Runners would be a great target. War Walkers would be a great target. By the way, Guide is no longer limited to core. You can basically target anything with this. You could target a Wraith Knight with this, it seems like, if you wanted to, which is awesome. And the Farseer's high movement of 14 makes it more likely to reach units that need it. His own unit and himself being great targets as well. Again, you put him with Wind Riders, you give him Shuriken Cannons, and you're good to go. We will talk about Wind Riders later. It's looking like they're pretty good. Let's just put it that way. Then we have the Warlock SkyRunner. So the Warlock SkyRunner, still objective control 2, movement 14, toughness 4, stuff like that. Has less wounds, obviously, being a Warlock. It has the Destructor weapon. So basically, it's a psychic attack. It's just like the old Destructor. Basically, I don't know if you guys remember this, but Destructor used to be a psychic power Warlocks used to take. It used to be a torrent weapon. It seems like it's the same now, except back in the day, it was a flame template instead of, the rule torrent. But it pretty much seems to stick to the same kind of feel and principle as the old weapon, which is that it has D6 attacks, strength 5, AP -1, damage 1. Pretty basic heavy flamer, right? So that's pretty good. Obviously, though, with 12-inch range, I don't know how often you're going to be using it unless you really need something to die. But there it is. As for the special rules, we have the Runes of Battle. So Runes of Battle now go off automatically. You don't have to roll that 2+ for it. They just happen, which is awesome, right? So every turn you can basically choose one of the following. Conceal, which gives your unit stealth, or Reveal, which targets a unit. Well, basically this is what it does. It targets your unit, but your unit gets to ignore cover, which is pretty good as well, right? You stick this again on Wind Riders, and all of a sudden your Wind Riders are ignoring cover, and they're always going to get their AP -1 from their Shuriken Cannons, which is amazing, right? Again, 4+ versus 3+ is a big damage boost. So if you can reduce an opponent's armor save to, a 4+, that's awesome. From a 2+ to a 3+, that's also really awesome as well. Makes this unit very deadly. Stealth isn't bad either, but when you have things like Fire and Fade and Phantasm, which I will talk about, again, 2 stratagems that are pretty awesome that we have, it's not going to matter much if you have -1 to hit, but it will matter against things that have indirect fire, which I will also talk about a little bit later. Stealth is a very powerful special rule against those specific types of weapons. And again, the Warlock SkyRunner seems pretty solid. Giving a -1 to hit or ignores cover to his unit is pretty decent. Destructor is good too, but it's kind of short-ranged. Probably won't be used all that often. I think the Warlock SkyRunner is going to be a solid pickup if you want to run a lot of Wind Riders. You want to run a big unit of them of 9. I think it's going to be solid to pick it up, but not absolutely necessary. And the reason I say that is because even though ignores cover is great, there are other things which we will talk about that also allow your units to ignore cover, including the Viper, which I'm sure will be an auto-include for most Eldar players in 10th edition, at least to start out. Oh, man. Rangers, right? I was excited to see Rangers, actually, because I have a unit of Rangers, the new ones that I recently bought. I have a bunch of old ones that are the metal ones. But, they were painted by my 11-year-old self, so they're not exactly in the best condition. A lot of them are broken and so forth. So I was excited to see this data sheet. Now, what I can say about Rangers is they're a little bit different than they were before. So basically looking at their stats, everything's exactly the same. They have objective control 1 though, which means they lost their objective control ability. So they're no longer a quote-unquote troops choice. The Ranger long rifle has also changed. It does have precision. It does have heavy. They hit on a 3+, but if they stand still with the heavy, they're getting a +1 to hit. Their weapon has strength 4, AP -1, damage 2. So their damage increased by 1, which is fairly significant. That means every one that goes through is going to kill a Space Marine. And if you wanted to, you could try to snipe a character out of a unit. As far as their ability goes, they have the Path of the Outcast. It's basically like the Termagant one, where if you move within 9 inches of them, they get to make a D6 movement. Again, this is good. This means they won't get assaulted that often, but I don't know if that's really that great. I'm going to be honest, right? D6 movement's nice if you're going to get assaulted, but it's not going to always save you, right? Especially against shooting. Now, as for their durability against shooting, they have a 5+ invulnerable save, which I guess is because they're very stealthy and can hide very easily. They also have the stealth special rule. So if you're in a piece of light cover with these guys, you're getting -1 to hit, you're getting a 5+ invulnerable save, and you're also getting a 4+ armor save. So that's pretty decent. It means you're always going to be saving on at least a 5+ with a -1 to hit, which should save the unit against, your bog standard Space Marine squad or things like that. It will not save you against something more serious. Infernus squads will absolutely devastate them still, no joke. I mean, let's be honest, Flamers did that before anyway. It's not a big, surprise. But it does mean that they are a little more vulnerable to certain types of weapons. So, namely, weapons that don't really have a whole lot of AP, but, can throw out a lot of shots that auto-hit, like Flamers. So where do I stand with this unit? Oh yeah, and it has Infiltrate as well. So where do I stand with it? Well, to be honest with you, I think it's a good unit still. I think it's more of a utility unit than anything else, being able to use Infiltrate to block enemy infiltrators and scouts. Maybe to get on objectives and things like that. But it doesn't look like there's any actions yet that I can see. I mean, I haven't seen the full mission rules yet for match play, so I don't know. But it doesn't look like there's any secondary objectives that require a unit to basically do nothing and just perform an action that turn. So I don't think they're going to be as useful in that way. But I think there's still going to be a solid utility unit that you want at least one of in your army. And basically to sum things up about the Rangers, again, having the stealth rule and a 5+ invul versus shooting make it a bit harder for them to be taken out in one shot, right? You're going to have to dedicate a little bit more than just one unit to kill them. They have reactive movement, which is nice. Basically makes it harder for them to be rapid fired or charged, which is also another thing you have to keep in mind. If an opponent wants to get within 9 inches of you to rapid fire and then charge you, they're going to have to be a little bit more careful about that. Although between you and me, I know that a lot of opponents are going to be aware of something like this, and they're just going to move right outside of 9 inches. They're still going to get their rapid fire, and you're going to be out of luck. The rifles are now damage 2, but lost the mortal wounds, and they have precision. So that's pretty decent. It means they can kill Marines a little bit easier. It means that targeting anything with an invulnerable save is going to be a little bit, probably won't end up mattering anyway, just because of the fact that they have low AP. But it does change their damage a little bit. They can also infiltrate, which is going to be their main purpose. They're going to be a utility unit. You're going to want to infiltrate with them, block off enemies from getting to objectives early and things like that. And I think that's where these guys will really shine, is basically controlling the battle from the first turn. So I think these guys are good. Do I think they're an auto-include? Probably not. They're not going to be an auto-include like they were in the past, but I know I'll probably be taking a unit just in case I go against somebody that is using a lot of infiltrators and wants to basically alpha strike me. That way I don't get alpha striked in one turn, right? Which is very possible. If somebody has a lot of infiltrator units, they can indeed in this edition, from what it looks like so far, just alpha strike you and kill you in turn 1. So you do have to be careful of that. And I think Rangers are the perfect counter to that type of play. Okay, so next up is Warwalkers. And Warwalkers got a big glow up in this edition. Now, we knew they were going to be good already because they can indeed carry Bright Lances. And with Unparalleled Mastery and Strands of Fate, we knew that they were going to be heavy damage dealers this edition. But what we didn't know is that they were going to have some really cool special rules to boot. So according to their datasheet, they got a little bit tougher at Toughness 7, which doesn't make a whole lot of difference, to be honest, but they did get 2 special abilities which make them extremely tough against enemy ranged fire, and that is a 4+ invulnerable save, which is permanent against everything, and they also get the Power Field, which makes them basically -1 to wound against ranged attacks. both of these together make the Warwalker pretty resilient against enemy fire, especially when you consider the fact that you can also use Strand's Dice defensively for invulnerable saves. So if you have a couple of 4s waiting in tow, you can use those to try to save your Warwalker from a few last cannons or, a few enemy Dark Lances, which is honestly quite the buff. Now, I don't know exactly how expensive Warwalkers are going to be points-wise. That may determine their cost effectiveness. A lot of people, if these things are way too expensive, might go another route, might do things like Vipers or whatever. But as far as I can tell, they're pretty good. I'm probably going to use at least one. You're probably going to see people using at least one of these in most lists, just because of the fact that it is pretty durable to enemy fire, and it's going to take enemies a lot more firepower to actually deal with these things than they're willing to give. So Warwalkers, in my opinion, one of the best reveals so far. They got a big durability boost, again, with a 4+ invul save and -1 to wound. They can pre-game move as well 9 inches, which is something I failed to mention earlier, which is also a good thing for getting line of sight, things like that on targets that may be hidden. They have toughness 7 as well, and their weapons are not twin-linked, which was a big worry for a lot of players because, obviously twin-linked weapons have much lower damage. And lastly, of course, with Unparalleled Mastery and Strands of Fate, it's going to be a powerful piece at any point level. I can't see people not taking this in any point level. If you talk about a combat patrol, this thing's useful. If you talk about 1,000-point games, 1,500-point games, 2,000-point games, it's going to be useful in every single point level. And honestly, I recently just bought another Warwalker, going to give it Bright Lances just because I think it's going to be that good. Moving on to the Fire Prism. The Fire Prism is something we've actually already seen. We've already seen the reveals for the weapons, but we haven't seen the reveals for the full datasheet. Now, if we look at it, we notice that it is still movement 14, so the range of movement is a little bit less than before, which is fine. It looks like everything's been reduced, including Dark Eldar units, as far as their vehicle speed. I suppose that's because transports can now dump their occupants out after moving. So I'm pretty sure that's just a basically game-wide reduction in the movement that vehicles can produce. But the Fire Prism is also toughness 9. So I thought it was going to be toughness 10. I thought Eldar vehicles were going to be a little bit tougher to represent maybe, a Jink or something like that, or their increased speed and maneuverability, but alas, toughness 9. Which puts them about at Rhino toughness, and that's going to make them much more fragile to anti-tank fire. So you do have to be extremely careful with these guys. Anti-tank weapons are very specialized this edition. Things like even missile launchers will be able to do serious damage against these, so you have to be careful. Its wounds value is also not that high. Wounds 12 is good, but it's not anything spectacular. So looking at the objective control, surprisingly, it's 3. And that's actually a big deal because that means Fire Prisms can potentially contest and even capture objectives in the late game. They have a good amount of speed. They can advance. And of course, with matchless agility, they can get a 20-inch movement, which means they can go into the mid-board, capture something that was either uncontested or lightly contested, and basically steal that away from enemy units. And check this out. You could even use Tank Shock to charge said unit, do some mortal wounds, and then basically, get your attacks, which now hit on a 4+, and steal that objective away from enemy units. It's not something your opponents may expect. They may put a squad of Marines on there in the late game to try to hold a mid-ground objective, and maybe you don't have much left. Maybe you don't have much to contest that objective anyway, but the Fire Prism can move forward. It can shoot a dispersed shot at the Marines, which is with, Unparalleled Mastery and the Crystal Targeting Matrix, which I'll go over in a second, is actually pretty good at killing heavy infantry just through sheer number of shots. Maybe you'll kill 1 or 2 Marines there. You get to charge in, you tank shock, you make your attacks, and guess what? On top of it all, your objective control 3. So as long as you can kill 4 Space Marines in that unit, you'll be basically controlling the objective, which is a big deal. So that's something pretty interesting to note. We've already seen the stats on the Prism Cannon. They have a disperse shot and a land shot. The land shot has the linked fire ability, which allows it to draw visibility through other fire prisms. Pretty good. You're probably going to want to take at least 2 of these in lists. I can't see these well, I can't see these not being good, I have to admit. Even at, 160 points or something like that, these guys seem pretty strong. Their attacks hit very hard. They have the Crystal Targeting Matrix ability, which allows them another reroll to hit and wound on top of Unparalleled Mastery. So yeah, Fire Prisms are going to be pretty good. I can't see these really being inefficient in any way. And the good news about them is that because they have flat damage, you don't need to really waste Strands of Fate dice on damage rolls. You can just choose to do 6 damage, which is really good. So I do think these are pretty solid. I think they're pretty self-sufficient as far as psychic powers and support go. You don't really need to cast a lot of psychic powers on them. You don't really need to use Strands of Fate on them. I think they're going to be a solid pick for 10th edition. So just basically a review of this thing. It has exceptional damage. It has 2 hit rerolls and 2 wound rerolls. It has an extremely high AP value, and with the help of a Viper, can even wreck stuff in cover. Just think about it, right? You have a really hard target sitting in the back. It's benefiting from cover. You hit it with a Viper's Bright Lance. That gets rid of its cover, does some damage. Then you clean up with the Fire Prism, right? Fire Prism will be ignoring its cover. So pretty much the best anyone can hope for is a 6+ save, unless they have an invul of some kind. And that's pretty awesome, right? Land Raiders in cover getting basically only a 6 up is pretty good. On top of that, Phantasm makes the CP cost to keep these safe very affordable. I talked about earlier that Fire and Fade may be too much of a CP cost to be used every single turn with these guys. And now with Phantasm being an option, which I will get into, for only 1 command point, that's going to be money right there. That's going to be gold. That's going to help your unit stay safe at a cheap command cost. And again, I suspect that running 2 of these in a list will be pretty common if, you want to go that direction with your anti-tank capabilities. And then we have Wind Riders. So Wind Riders were a unit that I was a little bit worried to see, I'm going to be honest. And the reason why is because I felt like their weapons were going to become twin-linked. And they have. Twin-linked Shuriken Catapults are obviously much worse than just having 2 Shuriken Catapults. We've known this throughout the editions. Rerolls are never as good, as just having more of something. However, I'm thinking that twin Shuriken Catapults will be priced accordingly, right? They're the weakest weapon on the list. They're probably going to be pretty cheap. However, Scatter Lasers and Shuriken Cannons are still amazing on these guys, and it seems like they can still pretty much take all of them. Right? They could change them out. Now, we don't know this for sure yet, but I'm thinking you could still probably take all Scatter Lasers or all Shuriken Cannons if you want to. As I believe every single box set comes with the option of having all 3 of them if you wanted to build them that way. So they have 14 movement, so their movement is reduced. Toughness 4, wounds 2, of course. They have objective control 2, which is really good because basically that means that even a unit of 3 of these guys can steal an objective away from a unit of 5 that doesn't have the battle line keyword, which is good. Usually battle line units will have objective control 2 as well. So, a unit of 5 tactical Marines will have objective control 10 in total on an objective. So they can steal objectives away from elite troops, which is good. And, they're very fast, so they can actually get to those objectives in the first place. They have the ability Swift Demise, which allows them to reroll 1s to hit against pretty much any unit they target, regardless of the weapon. It no longer just has to be Shuriken Catapults. It can be Scatter Lasers, it could be Shuriken Cannons. If the unit is on an objective, they get to reroll all their hits. So it's basically a free guide if you're targeting units on objectives. Just think about that for a second. A free guide if you're targeting a unit on an objective. And yes, opponents will have to put their troops on objectives. And especially against Marine-type players, they're going to be wanting to basically put tactical Marines or something equivalent on those objectives in the early turns. This gives your Wind Riders a really easy target, right? Space Marines out in the open, especially if you're ignoring their cover, don't have much in the way of a great armor save against AP. You have AP -1 on your Shuriken Cannons and sustained 1. You are re-rolling all your hits, and you can easily fish for 6s if you wanted to by just re-rolling, any dice you wanted to try to get those 6s. Because you can re-roll all of the dice, it makes your odds much better of getting those critical hits. But not only that, but these guys have exceptional synergy with other things in the army. For example, they have exceptional synergy with the Warlock SkyRunner, which can give them the ignores cover ability. So that's really good as well. So even if the Marines are in cover, they're going to be basically ignoring it. On top of that, you can give these guys the Blade Storm stratagem. So for one command point, if your opponent has maybe a unit of 10 Marines on the objective, you can use Blade Storm, which turns every critical wound into an AP -2 shot. So it's basically additional AP -2. It's just like the Shirkin special rule of the previous edition. So not only are you getting a lot of hits with sustained hits 1 and basically guide, but you're also being able to, on critical wounds, get an additional AP -2. This is going to absolutely shred units of heavy infantry with shuriken cannons. And then if you have the command points for it, you could either use Fire and Fade to get them back behind cover with their movement 14, or if you don't have as many command points, you can always use Phantasm to move them 7 inches behind a piece of terrain at the end of your opponent's movement phase. So overall, yeah, Wind Riders, right? I didn't actually think these guys would be that good. I'm hoping the shuriken cannon is priced, around the same cost it is now. I'm really hoping the Shuriken Cannon Wind Riders aren't like 50 points a model. I think that would be just way too much. I'm hoping they're around the same cost as they are now. I think they're pretty effective now in this edition, just as far as damage goes. I think they can put out a lot of it, and I think they probably should remain at around the same cost. And if they do, they're going to be looking pretty good. So Shuriken Catapults obviously becoming twin-linked is a bit of a nerf. I don't think you'll be obviously seeing people taking twin-linked Shuriken Catapults unless they're using these guys as just quick objective scores. Rerolling ones to hit is always good, but if the target is on an objective, you can reroll all hits, which is amazing. It's a free guide, right? And it means if you don't want to support these guys with guide, you don't have to, because these guys already have a built-in guide for them as long as you target units on objectives. The Shuriken Cannons are obviously absolutely brutal on these guys. The scatter lasers are also good, but the cannons look to be the clear winners before points are considered. Again, if scatter lasers are really cheap, a unit of these guys running scatter lasers with a Blade Storm stratagem could be very good as well. And lastly, they did lose some speed. They don't auto advance 6 anymore either, which is something they lost, but they do have objective control 2, meaning they can easily steal objectives. And again, 14-inch movement with, if you wanted to use matchless agility and get that 6-inch advance, you could to steal an objective to move about 20 inches. All right, so time to talk about the Big Daddy Kahandris, the Phoenix Lord. A lot of people were concerned that Phoenix Lords wouldn't be as good in this edition, and I have sad news for you guys. I don't think they are going to be as good in this edition. The reason why is because a lot of the ways people were using them before was as solo actors, using the unit without necessarily using them in conjunction with the aspect warriors of their chosen aspect. And now that has to change because Phoenix Lords do not have the lone operative keyword. And as far as I can tell, they are epic heroes, so can't get any enhancements to become lone operatives, even if we did have something like that they could use, which I don't think they do, to be honest. Now, Kahandris, though, when leading a unit of striking scorpions, is quite good. As far as his defensive stats go, they're obviously much worse. Being a leader, usually all of our leaders got a reduction in toughness level. But you have a couple of different options here. So you can attack with one weapon a turn. You have Ismathil and you have Aura's Bane. Both of them are pretty good. Obviously, the Scorpion's Claw, Aura's Bane is better against heavy targets, heavy infantry, and Ismathil is better against light targets. Both of them have the sustained hits 1 ability. So every 6 to hit, you're getting an additional auto hit. As far as Kahandris' special rules, we have Shadow Hunter, which gives the unit he's leading +1 to hit. And again, they're only going to be leading striking scorpions. This does not, unfortunately, affect sustained hits, right? +1 to hit just means +1 to hit. It doesn't mean that you can get a 5+ critical hit. So unfortunately, that's not much synergy there, but it's still a good damage buff regardless. It also has Sustained Assault. So basically what Sustained Assault does is when Kahandris makes a charge move, an unmodified 4+ scores a critical hit. So that means that instead of, getting critical hits for sustained 1 on 6s, he's getting them on 4s, which makes him a lot more deadly. Lastly, he has the Scorpion's Bite, which gives him devastating wounds on his attacks. Basically the same as the Striking Scorpion's Mandiblaster rule, except for, he can actually affect monsters and vehicles with it, which is very good. And that means that nothing is going to be safe from Kahandris' Mortal Wound devastation. And just keep in mind that every single 4+ he gets to hit is going to be a critical hit, which gives him another attack. And then on top of that, every 6 to wound is going to be mortal wounds, which is pretty strong. So I think overall Kahandris is going to be a pretty big melee threat, but he's not going to be the monster that he was in 9th edition, just because of the fact that he's really easy to kill now. Obviously, striking scorpions are tough, but they're not that tough. Being a melee unit puts them at more danger than other units in your army, because obviously they're going to be in the front line, charging in, doing damage in close combat. And Kahandris really doesn't have any way of helping his unit survive or helping himself survive. There's no more wound cap. He lost some survival in the form of his wounds and toughness. And lastly, he just has a 4+ invul save to save him, which is good, but it's just not that good, right? You could use Strands of Fate to manipulate this and so forth, but a 4+ invul save is still rather on the weak side. And honestly, a lot of enemy units are just going to be basically able to kill this guy through small arms fire because he's toughness 3. Yes, he has a 2+ save, but in my experience, when you throw enough dice at something, you tend to roll 1s and 2s. And a lot of weapons will have AP 1 still, especially special weapons and things like that. So Kahandris, really good damage, helps striking scorpions hit harder, a lot less survivable, and probably a lot less threatening against certain lists. Lists that are able to shoot the striking scorpions and kill them very easily won't have much trouble against Kahandris. And then we have the good old Azerman. So Azerman, he has a pretty strong datasheet, I have to say. Now, obviously, I don't think any Phoenix Lord is going to be as tough as they were in 9th edition because they did lose their wound cap. But if we look at Azerman real quick, he does have a good range attack with lethal hits, which is always good. His weapons also have the pistol keyword, so he can shoot them in combat if he wanted to, which is also very powerful. They hit on 2+, strength 4, AP -1, damage 2. They have 6 attacks. And then he has his Sword of Azur, which has devastating wounds on the profile. And these attacks are pretty hefty. They're weapon skill 2+, strength 6, AP -3, and damage 3. This is very strong. On top of that, having devastating wounds is always good. He has the Hand of Azurin, so basically, if he's leading his unit of Dire Vengers, which is the only unit he can join now, they get a +1 to hit, which is always good with a shooting unit that has a lot of attacks. He also has Tactical Acumen. And basically what this does is it allows his unit of Dire Vengers to overwatch for free, so 0 command points, and on top of that, you can do this even if you've overwatched with another unit in the army already. So check this out. This is something I've been brainstorming a little bit because I was kind of sad that the old Hand of Azurin, Fuegan combo got messed up a little bit in this edition. And for those of you guys who don't know about that trick, it basically you take Fuegan, you put him in a unit of Dire Vengers. With Fuegan's beam attack, you kill one of the Dire Vengers, and that is basically allows you to proc the Hand of Azurian stratagem. Well, not the Hand of Azurian. I think it's called Avengers of Azurian or something like that. But it's that stratagem that allows you to fire twice with Dire Vengers. And basically, you get to fire twice with them, with Guide, with Doom, with all that good stuff, and just really rack up damage. Well, there's something you can do with Azerman now that basically replicates this in a big way. So check this out. If you want to run an aspect-heavy army, and you're wondering if your aspect warriors will indeed still be effective, look no further. Take Azurian, put them in a unit of 10 Dire Vengers, put them in a Wave Serpent. Put another unit of 10 Dire Vengers and another Wave Serpent on the other side of the battlefield. Turn 1, move up your Wave Serpent 14 inches, dump your Dire Vengers out on an objective. All you have to do is control the objective. So that means you only need one Dire Venger on that objective to count it as controlled unless an enemy is already on it. And even if there are infiltrators on it already, you can easily shoot them off of it with your Dire Avengers in your turn. The enemy turn comes around, and you will have 2 command points now to use for Overwatch. But you only need 1 because Azerman is going to give you basically a free Overwatch. Dire Avengers will Overwatch on 4+. So not only are you able to shoot once with both units of Dire Avengers, but you're going to be able to shoot again with both units hitting on a 4+ against anything that moves within 18 inches of them. And yes, your opponent is not going to really be able to get around this because they're going to have to advance to the objectives, which means that they're probably going to have to get into range of your Dire Avenger units, which means they're going to get hit in the face with Overwatch at 4+. And Dire Avengers, if you haven't already heard, have lethal hits now. So every 6 to hit is an auto wound, which is pretty strong. So even tougher targets can potentially be hurt by the Dire Avengers Overwatch. And on top of this, Azerman has a 3+ save. So this is all very powerful, right? Azerman looks to be a good leader of Dire Avengers. In fact, if you're taking an Aspect Warrior-centric army and you have a unit of 10 Dire Avengers in your list, I would recommend taking Azerman. He's a perfect choice for it. He gives your Dire Avengers a little bit of punch in combat, and he also allows them to Overwatch for free, and Dire Avengers hit their Overwatch on 4+ now. So, is Azerman as good as he once was? In a way, yes. I think he's better in supporting Dire Avengers. I think obviously as a single combatant, he's a little bit worse because he doesn't have a wound cap, he's less survivable, etc. But he has some solid abilities that help Dire Avengers out. He gives them a free Overwatch. He has good melee damage with devastating wound support. He gives them a +1 to hit as well, so you're hitting on 2+ in their shooting phase. You will not be able to use the +1 to hit as an Overwatch attack, just to let you guys know, because Overwatch hits on a fixed value, but you will be able to essentially use it for their shooting phase. And, you know, this is going to be a solid choice for a lot of Aspect builds out there, I presume. And next up, we have a long-awaited datasheet, the Viper. So the Viper is not much change from before as far as its stats go. It has had its movement reduced. It's still, well, I think it got boosted 1 toughness. And that's about it. It has objective control too, which is not bad if you think about it. So as far as a vehicle goes, a light vehicle like this having objective secure 2 is actually pretty decent. So it can steal objectives from single models with objective control 1, which isn't the greatest objective control out there, but it's not bad. Now, the reason you take this now is because of its special rule, Harassment Fire. In the shooting phase, after you have shot, select an enemy unit that you have hit, and that unit cannot benefit from cover until the end of that phase, making this a great support unit. The Viper can also take any of the Eldar special weapons, so Bright Lances, Star Cannons, Shuriken Cannons, etc. Now, I presume that the Bright Lance is going to be the best option for this guy, just because you have Unparalleled Mastery, you can reroll a hit and wound. That makes the Viper a potentially very big threat against vehicles, even if its cost is rather low, which I suspect it kind of will be. I suspect that this thing will be around 60 points or so, maybe 65 points for a Bright Lance, just because of the fact the Bright Lance is very powerful, but other than that, the Viper is, you know, normally a very fragile piece. So I think it'll be probably on the cheaper side when compared with things like Warwalkers and Fire Prisms, obviously. Now, the other kind of cool thing about the Viper, which a lot of people won't pick up on right away, but the fact that ruins now give the plunging fire ability if you are 6 inches above and buildings as well, means that the Viper can get on top of one of these structures and actually get -1 AP on its attacks. So you could theoretically have a Bright Lance hitting on AP -4. And if you use another Viper to ignore the unit's cover, you can essentially either ignore the opponent's armor save completely or negate it to a 6+ if they have a 2+ save on their vehicle. So overall, that's really strong. I think Vipers are going to be a very big utility piece in most armies, and I suspect that people will take at least 2 of them in most lists. And just to sum up, hitting a target with its weapons, again, is going to be very easy. This thing hits on a 3+, it gets a free reroll to hit per turn, and its ability to ignore the benefit of cover is huge. It's fast, and it's amazing with a Bright Lance, considering you can have Unparalleled Mastery and Strands of Fate support. And again, I'm going to be running 2 of these in my list just because I know that this is a very powerful unit. And unless it's very expensive, upward to 80 or 90 points, I'm going to be taking 2 of these in the list just because they're very strong on their own and they support the rest of your army, which is very awesome. And lastly, because of their special rule and their ability to, use the Bright Lance against enemy vehicles, I think these support each other very well and work very well in pairs. Okay, so next up is Warp Spiders. Now, Warp Spiders got a little bit of a change that I think a lot of you are going to be a little bit unhappy with. The reason why is because even though they still have their 12 movement, their 3+ save, all the stats are basically the same. 2 things changed about Warp Spiders. One is their weapon. Their weapon is now a Devastating Wounds Torrent weapon with 12-inch range, D6 attacks that auto-hit because of the Torrent keyword, but they don't have Blast anymore. So that means they're getting auto-hits instead of basically additional hits. Now, this is not bad in and of itself, but the strength of this weapon is rather low. Strength 4 historically has never been applied to Death Spinners. Death Spinners have always been a larger strength weapon, strength 6 usually, with a good amount of AP, AP -1 or AP -2. In past editions, of course, in 5th and 4th and before that, they didn't have any AP. And it seems like they're going to have 0 AP once again. Their mortal wounds will be effective against highly armored, invul save targets like Terminators, but unfortunately against Terminators, the strength 4 is going to be wounding on 5s. So they're probably not going to have that much success even against those types of targets. As for their special rule, instead of making a battle focus move, they now just get to double their movement once per turn. So when they move, they can move actually 24 inches if they roll a d6. On a 2+, nothing happens. On a 1, you lose a member of the unit, but you can still move the 24 inches, which is still nice. Other than that, the Exarch basically just has his additional Death Spinner, and of course Power Blades, which make him a little better in close combat. Which, against certain targets, may actually be a possibility. Warp Spiders in close combat don't seem all that much awful. The Exarch himself does pretty decent damage. He has 3 attacks, hits on a 3+, strength 4, AP -2, damage 1. Not great, but not terrible at the same time. So what do these changes mean for Warp Spiders? Well, for one, you're not going to be able to use them in the same way. Their role has indeed changed. They're no longer going to be a bludgeon to basically destroy enemies through blunt force, right? I mean, putting Guide on these guys and putting Doom on an enemy unit usually meant that you were going to obliterate that unit through sheer amount of wounds that you would score. Having the Blast keyword also really helped as well for units 10 and over. These guys also tended to be better against tough targets, toughness 5 or toughness 4, because they could wound on a 3+ still. So you're not going to be able to use Warp Spiders as easily against those targets. Did that Spinner again lost Blast, 2 strength, its AP, and gained Torrent and Devastating Wounds, which make it really good against light infantry, but not so good against heavier infantry. And I still think these guys are going to be good against toughness 4 models, things like Intercessors, Tactical Marines, things like that. But against heavier targets like Terminators, I think these guys will struggle a little bit to do any damage. And also due to the fact that they really have no ability to have any kind of wound support. There's very little rerolls to wound in the Codex aside from Unparalleled Mastery that we know of so far. Doom is now a +1 to wound, so it's not a rerolls wounds ability, so you're not going to be able to synergize with that. So what is the Warp Spider's new role? Well, I think that Warp Spiders are now going to function as a fast flanking unit that can rip apart vulnerable targets regardless of hit modifiers. So what that means is it's going to be really good against targets with an average armor save that have things that make you at a -1 to hit and things like that. So units like infantry, right, that have all these, negative modifiers. I think that's going to be the Warp Spider's preferred target. So units that are used for objective holding in the backfield, right? Light infantry, like things like cultists, things like intercessors that are just going to be sitting on a back objective, not really doing much movement. Warp Spiders are going to be great for targeting those units, getting into them, and eliminating them. Also keep in mind that if you do want to keep these guys safe, there is a way to do it. And a lot of people haven't caught on to this yet. But Flicker Jump basically increases their movement to 24 until the end of the shooting phase. Fire and Fade happens at the end of the shooting phase. Do you see where I'm going with this? You can use Fire and Fade to move these guys 24 inches. So if you did want a bigger unit to do some damage and then run away, 24 inches somewhere else, you could definitely do that as the rules are written now. Which means that Warp Spiders can essentially remain invulnerable to a lot of damage. 24 inches is a lot of movement, guys. You could technically move these guys from one side of the board to the other, hit a target, and then run back behind obscuring terrain every single turn if you wanted to for 2 command points. It is a little bit command point intensive, but it is an option. This can also help you get a small unit of Warp Spiders from one side of the board to another to capture an objective. So do I think Warp Spiders have the same role before in a heavy damage dealing unit? No. But they have a lot more utility, even though they have less damage. And I think Warp Spiders are still going to be a unit you're going to want to include in a lot of Aspect Warrior lists because they are very powerful at dealing with those light targets that like to hide. You know, those units that your Howling Banshees or Dire Avengers or Dark Reapers can't reach. Well, here we are again. Storm Guardians. My favorite unit in the entire codex, and what do you know? They're usable now. Now, when I say usable, I don't mean that they are good in close combat, because they're not. Their close combat stats are pitiful. They basically just get 2 strength 3, AP nothing, damage 1 attacks. So they're theoretically worse than they were before, at least as far as their raw damage goes, than this edition. How Storm Guardians could even get worse in close combat, I have no idea. However, they do have a few interesting special rules. So one of the special rules that they have is called Storm Blades. So basically, it gives them sticky objectives, which is a good ability, especially for an Eldar list that's very fast and often doesn't want to be babysitting backfield objectives. Now, this ability's strength is going to rely solely on your opponent. If your opponent has a lot of slow-moving units that can't get to your deployment zone, this is going to be a fantastic ability. If your opponent does have a lot of fast-moving units that can easily get to your deployment zone, it's going to be a shit ability, and it's not going to do you anything because your opponent is going to steal that objective as soon as you move off of it. Other than that, Storm Guardians still have a 4+ save, and now their Serpent Shield just gives them a 5+ invulnerable save. It's not just against shooting anymore. And I actually think this is pretty good because this means that Storm Guardians can actually be used to tie up enemies in close combat fighting around objectives. And because they have objective secured 2, or objective control 2, they can actually do battle with tactical marines fairly easily around objectives. Their combat stats are absolute crap, obviously, and they probably won't be able to kill the Space Marines, but they can at least take the objective away from them and tie them up in close combat. If these guys are priced accordingly to be cheap, I'm thinking something like 7 points a model, I think they could be pretty decent at that role. So I have high hopes for Storm Guardians being useful in that way. As far as their damage goes, though, even with special weapons, they don't seem to be that effective. Flamers are just, basic strength 4, AP nothing torrent weapons, and the Guardian Fusion Gun is just a melta weapon that has strength 8, AP -4, and damage D6. Not exactly great against vehicles, right? But pretty effective against heavy infantry. Not that it'll matter that often. So, in conclusion for the Storm Guardians, I think obviously their combat stats are still awful, right? They're still terrible. They're still never going to kill anything. Their special weapons don't really do them any favors either, and especially if they're going to be a lot of points, they're not going to be that good. I assume also power weapons, being strength 4, AP -2, are going to be just expensive upgrades that you probably won't want to take with the unit. The Serpent Shield is slightly better now as it works in combat as well. They also have sticky objectives, which is going to be good against certain opponents, really effective against them, but against other opponents, it might not be that great. Now, what it does do is it forces your opponent to react to your backfield, right? So it does allow you to do that, but including 10 Storm Guardians in a list might be more expense than it's worth. especially if you just plan on using Guardians to sit on those objectives in the backfield anyway to farm Fate Dice, which, to be honest with you, I think most players are going to prefer. So, regardless of these complaints that I have about them not being good in combat, I do think they are better than they were before, just because of the fact that having sticky objectives can mean a lot against certain opponents. And it can impact the battlefield in a greater way than Storm Guardians were ever able to do in the past. Alright, so moving on to the Wave Serpent. The Wave Serpent is a unit that I was relieved to see in this reveal. However, I wasn't impressed by it. Looking at its stats, it only has one more wound than a Falcon or a Fire Prism. So, not much more in the way of survivability. As far as its Serpent Shield, it looks like it has a 5+ invulnerable save, which is decent, but not spectacular. Right? I mean, as we saw, the Warwalker had a 4+ invul save. So, as far as the Serpent Shield goes, it seems to be a less effective version than the Warwalkers. As far as its special rule goes, the Wave Serpent Shield, I actually don't like this rule at all. This reminds me of something they gave the Wave Serpent in 5th edition, and everyone hated it because it was overpowered. Now, not that this rule is overpowered, I think quite the opposite in this case, but the feel of it is just not right to me. I do understand that there's some lore behind this, but it always just felt wrong to use this ability. So basically, once per battle, you can select an enemy unit within 12 inches. Doesn't matter at the end of the phase or what. Seems like you can use it anytime, any place, just once per battle. Basically, you target a unit within 12. That unit suffers D3 wounds, and D3 mortal wounds, I should say, and takes a battle shock test. So most of the time, against most opponents, the battle shock will mean nothing, right? Most opponents have a pretty good leadership value. If they don't, then they're probably not a very high priority target anyway. But it could be useful, right? So it's an ability that may or may not be useful. You do have to be within 12 inches, though, of a unit to use it. So you do have to be very close to that enemy unit, which means your cargo is also going to have to be close. Because if you drop them off, you're going to need to make sure that, one, the unit is far enough away not to be shot at with Overwatch and die. But two, you're going to need to make sure that the Wave Serpent itself is in range of the target to deny that Overwatch. Now, a little bit of a tricky thing you can do with this is that you can actually move the Wave Serpent first, move it into position, and then use this ability before you disembark your unit, which is totally legal because you can use this ability at any time, not specifically in one phase or the other. So basically what you can do is before you dump out your Dire Avengers or Fire Dragons or whatever, you can use this ability and potentially deny your opponent's ability to Overwatch. Now, it's just a test, so there's no guarantee of this, so I wouldn't plan anything around it. But it's one of those things that may be useful, and it does do D3 mortal wounds, so that's okay as well, I guess. Now, it can also target any enemy unit. Any enemy. So that even means very tough targets. So in a pinch, you could target something massive that has a very strong invul save, maybe a monster or something like that. If you need a couple more wounds on it, this can actually deal those last few mortal wounds. So it's not all bad. I was just hoping for a more dynamic or interesting special rule from the Wave Serpent, but alas, you can't win them all, and we've already had a pretty strong reveal so far, so having one or two units that are unimpressive is not that bad, right? So I can't really complain too much. Now, the other thing I didn't mention was that all of the Wave Serpent weapons became twin-linked, which sucks. Let's be real. Twin-linked is much worse than just having two of that weapon. But in the wide scheme of things, I don't think it'll be that big of a deal. In essence, the weapons will probably be a little bit cheaper as a result. As for its transport capacity, it can carry 12 models, like usual, and Wraith constructs basically take the place of 2 models. And it can transport jump pack units. So this is all the same stuff as before as far as its transport capacity goes. So what do I think overall of the Wave Serpent? Well, obviously all weapons are now twin-linked, which is a nerf. Kind of sucks as far as its damage goes, but it's not the worst thing in the world. This thing was never meant for pure damage. It has a 5+ invul save in combat as well, and at ranged, but it lost transhuman with its Serpent shield, which is another nerf to its survivability. It has a once per game ability that does D3 mortal wounds and forces a battle shock test to a unit within 12. This is okay, but it's not spectacular by any means. And in general, it looks really disappointing compared with the Falcon that has supporting fire and better weapons. Still, it's the only way to transport a max unit, so I'm sure you'll still see the Wave Serpent in many lists, especially with that Azerman combo I talked about earlier. But in general, I think the Wave Serpent is just a little bit worse than the Falcon in terms of utility and also just raw damage. Next up, we have our favorite support weapons. So support weapons saw a couple changes and a few really big buffs that were surprising even to me as somebody who's played Eldar for a very long time. One of the things is support weapons have movement 3 now. This is how it was in the past, and it's probably how it should be. I don't think artillery pieces should move very fast at all. Toughness 6, which is essentially almost the same. They have a 4+ save, which is, average. I think they had that last time as well. They have 5 wounds apiece, which is, again, about the same. And they have the objective control 1. Not that you'd be trying to control objectives with these things anyway. Now, here's the couple of things that will probably make a lot of you smile, especially if you have D-cannons. Here's what the D-cannon does, everybody. D-cannon, range 24, attacks D3, ballistic skill 3+, strength 16, AP -4, damage D6 +2. This isn't even the good part. This has a really high strength, really high AP, really high damage. That alone would have been good enough to include in most lists. Check out its special rules. Blast, devastating wounds, indirect fire. And of course, the heavy keyword, as if all that wasn't enough. So just let that sink in for a second. We have access to a D3 attacks weapon that has strength 16, AP -4, and damage D6 +2 that has devastating wounds. So you know what that means? That means, on average, you can kill a Land Raider with one of these things. If you have the Strands dice for it, which you will, because you'll probably have a Farseer, and you'll probably have a couple of 5s and 6s in your back pocket for Strands dice. Guys, this is basically an auto kill of a Land Raider. We don't really have to do much for it either, because we have unparalleled mastery for a reroll to hit and a reroll to wound. That means we're hitting on 3+ out of line of sight with the heavy keyword. We're wounding on a 2+ with rerolls. And if we wanted to, we could use Strands dice to make that wound roll a 6 and give it mortal wounds. We can even go one step further and make the damage roll a 6 with Strands of Fate, or even, hell, a 5. That's still really good. And do mortal wounds equal to the damage, so 8 or 7 mortal wounds to the target. You have 2 attacks, so if you do this to both attacks, you will be one-shotting most tough vehicles in the game. It doesn't matter if it's a Land Raider or a Votann Land Fortress. That thing is going to be destroyed regardless of whether or not it has a special rule for an armor save or what have you. This is exceptionally powerful. And I can't stress this enough, that even one D-cannon can destroy a target like that. I don't think in any world we can compare this to last edition's D-cannon. Last edition's D-cannon was very strong, and it was a meta unit. This edition's D-cannon is an auto-include. It's going to be in tournament lists. I guarantee you at least one. Even if this thing is 100 points a model, it's going to be included in very competitive lists. It's that good. It will probably see a nerf in some way. You're probably going to see it lose one of its keywords in one of the next patches down the road. But again, it makes sense, right? I mean, D-cannons lore-wise are able to do stuff like this. So I think lore-wise, for all you people who are really into the lore of the game and really want the units to reflect the lore, here you go. D-cannons, right? This reflects the lore perfectly. Okay, so D-cannons. Moving on to the Shadow Weaver. Shadow Weaver is also really good. Blast, indirect fire, devastating wounds, and the heavy keyword means that it can do really good damage against light infantry. It has D6 +2 attacks, hits on 3+ still, strength 6, AP 0, damage 1. But it has devastating wounds, so it kind of makes up for it. This is going to be very effective at taking out light targets in the enemy backfield because it has indirect fire. Again, things like cultists, things like, tactical space marines, stuff like that. It's going to be very effective against. So I do like the Shadow Weaver as well, especially in groups of 3. I think in groups of 3, if you throw guide on this thing, could be very effective. Again, rerolling all your hits is really good, especially if you have that many attacks. It could be very devastating to enemy units. Then we have the Vibro Cannon, the old vibrator cannon. And it sucks. Newsflash, the Vibro Cannon still sucks. So here's a little fun fact. I've never liked the Vibro Cannon. The first support weapon I ever built was a Vibro Cannon. And I remember using it in 2 games when I was a kid. And I remember the first game, I rolled the dice against, I think it was a vehicle. And back in the day, you basically glanced vehicles on a certain value. So I remember rolling a glancing hit. And I remember immobilizing the vehicle and thinking that was so cool. And then I played a second game with it. And I realized that it was really actually very difficult to get a glancing hit in the first place. And I shot it 6 times that game, and it didn't score any damage whatsoever. It really just made my opinion of the vibrator cannon extremely low. My expectations for the Vibro Cannon ever since have been extremely low. Some might say absolutely abysmal. So every single edition, I expect the Vibro Cannon to be crap. And guess what? It's still crap. Range 48, D6 attacks, ballistic skill 3+, strength 8, AP -1, damage 2. It no longer has the ability to gain strength as you have more vibrator cannons in the unit. So unfortunately, it's not even good in multiples. It doesn't auto hit, it doesn't get bonuses to wound, nothing. And it requires line of sight. This is probably the most garbage option of the 3, and I assume that it's also going to be the cheapest option of the 3, but we'll see. The Vibro Cannon, I've never been a big fan of. For one, its name is really silly and, to be honest, kind of gross if you think about it. And yeah, it's just, it's not my style, let's just put it that way. Lastly, we have the Artillery Barrage special ability. So basically, this is a really good ability. If it's not targeting a monster or a vehicle unit, that unit hit will suffer -1 to hit on the next shooting round, basically. Your opponent's next shooting phase, it'll have -1 to hit. That's a very good ability, especially for things like Shadow Weavers. It's amazing. With D-Cannons, it's not so good because when are you ever going to fire a D-Cannon at an infantry unit? Probably not very often, but even so, when you don't have a good target with the D-Cannon, this can be a pretty awesome option for you. The other thing I would just like to mention really quick is even though support weapons only have movement 3, so fire and fade is absolute garbage on them, you could target them with Phantasm instead and get 7 inches of movement out of it. So if you wanted to move the D-Cannon up your 3 inches and fire and be, in line of sight or whatever it is, you can still get back to safety relatively easily with Phantasm. So, in conclusion, the D-Cannon is God, and all must bow before its might. This is a Titan killer. This is a God killer. This will kill anything that your opponent has, regardless of what special rules they may or may not have. Maybe not the Avatar of Cain, because the Avatar of Cain halves damage now, which, again, is a carryover from last edition, but it's a very rare thing this edition. Unless it's the Avatar of Cain or something like it, that unit is going to die. Period. There's no way around it. There's no bonuses unless it has an ability to ignore mortal wounds or get some sort of feel no pain against those things. It's not going to be very fun. The Shadow Weaver is pretty strong against light infantry and it has a lot of attacks. I'm very impressed with the Shadow Weaver. I like it a lot. It also has devastating wounds just like the Death Spinners, which makes sense because Shadow Weavers are essentially just giant Death Spinners. And the Vibro Cannon sucks as usual. But, whatever. It's a meme, I guess. It's just forever going to be a meme. It requires line of sight, has an AP of -1, and has no stacking effects. It's absolute garbage, and I'm guessing nobody will ever take it. But who knows? Maybe there'll be some brave soul out there who can find a way to make it work, including me in a future video. Yeah, I'll probably will make a video on the Vibro cannon eventually and maybe ways to make it work down the road. We'll see. All right, next unit up is Dire Avengers. So Dire Avengers are looking pretty strong. Instead of their Shirkin special rule and their extra AP, they're now just getting lethal hits, which is really awesome. They still have 3 attacks and they're still pretty good at shooting. As far as their close combat weapons go, it's garbage. The Exarch is probably going to want to take 2 Shirkin catapults. The Power Glaive and the Dire Sword are decent weapons, but they're not spectacular. As far as their ability goes, this is, I think, where they really shine. And Defensive Tactics allows them to Overwatch on a 5+, but if they're controlling an objective, they get to Overwatch on a 4+. Which is insane. Think about it. Think about putting a unit of 10 of these on a no man's land objective and overwatching an enemy target after you shoot them. That's pretty insane. So think about that in combination with lethal hits, right? You're hitting on 4+, but every 6 is auto wounding. They overwatch on a 5+ and a 4+ when controlling an objective. And again, think about dropping 20 of these guys in no man's land, 1 unit having a Azerman in it. You're overwatching twice after you shoot. That's a lot of shots. And it's not something that a lot of opponents are going to easily be able to get around or deal with. One quick thing I want to mention, though, is that it seems like Exarch powers are gone. I don't know where they are. They're not on the data sheet. So unless they're somewhere else in the index, I think we've lost Exarch powers. I think those are out, which is unfortunate. I really liked Exarch powers, but I kind of understand the dilemma with Exarch powers. There was always one that was just an auto include, and the other 2 were usually either very situational or they were just outright useless. So I understand why, if they did in fact get rid of Exarch powers, why they did so, but it's kind of a shame to see that go away. Exarch powers were a really cool part of the Elder Codex and Aspect Warriors for a long time. Then we have Striking Scorpion. So this is the close combat brother of the Dire Avenger. Looking at their attacks, pretty good. They have 4 attacks apiece. 0 AP now, so they're not getting any AP on their attacks, but they still hit on 3+. They're getting sustained 1. Every 6th they hit will generate another auto hit. And they have devastating wounds against infantry units, but not against monsters and vehicles. But that also means that possibly jet bikes and mounted units they will get their devastating wounds against as well. They also have the Infiltrator's ability, which allows them to infiltrate on the battlefield. So what do I think of these guys? Well, I don't think they're quite as good as last edition, and in general, I think combat units are going to be worse in this edition than last. Considering that every combat unit that I've seen so far has gotten worse, I don't think Striking Scorpions have been hit exceptionally hard. They still have sustained hits and devastating wounds versus infantry, which is a downgrade, especially since they hit at strength 4 now, but it's not a super downgrade. I think they're still going to be able to tackle lighter targets and heavier targets with buffs. These guys are actually a pretty decent target for guide because they do have sustained hits. The Biting Blade and the Scorpion's Claw are options that you're going to have to choose a little bit more carefully now. It's not an auto include like it was before, the Biting Blade, but the Biting Blade is still good. Gives more attacks than the Scorpion's Claw and grants more strength than the Scorpion Chainsword. But the Scorpion's Claw gives just higher strength value in general, higher AP, but it has a -1 to hit on it. So it's a tough choice. I don't know exactly which one's better. I assume that they're both going to be good against toughness 4 equally, but anything higher than that, and I think the Scorpion's Claw is going to win out at that point. They can also infiltrate, which gives them a pretty good way to get into combat. However, if you do get second turn, they no longer have that safety net of Phantasm being able to redeploy them into reserve or into a safer spot on the battlefield. So you do have to be careful about that as well. So I think overall they're going to be a solid unit, more specialized to hunting lighter targets, but might be a really good unit out of a Falcon because a Falcon allows them to reroll the wound roll against their target, which is very good with devastating wounds. So that is something you might see. Eldrad Uthran. Eldrad, my boy. Eldrad has gotten a little bit of a change, which is good and bad. I think Eldrad is going to be a good model in general, but not an auto-include. Now, here's why I think that. As far as its stats go, he's pretty decent. He has toughness 4 versus 3, has 5 wounds, so he's basically just a Farseer with a little bit more toughness. He has a 4+ invul save now. alone instead of with transhuman, so that's kind of a bummer. As far as his ability goes, you roll 3 extra d6 in the beginning of the battle, and you add that to your strands dice, so instead of 12, you're getting a 15 total. That's pretty awesome. Pretty good ability there. He also has Doom, which gives basically your whole army +1 to wound against that enemy target within 18 inches. You do need line of sight, though, so that means that Eldrad is probably going to be a better unit to be a little bit more on the front lines. As far as his weapons go, he does have more punch than a Farseer in close combat. 3 attacks, hitting on 2+, with strength 5, AP -1, and damage 2. It does also have the anti-infantry keyword, so it's going to always be wounding on 2. So Eldrad, yeah, he's a little bit better in close combat. But are you really going to have him in close combat that much? Probably not. So what do I think about Eldrad? Well, Big Daddy here comes with 3 extra fate dice at the beginning of the game, which is massive. It's a really good buff. But that comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of not being able to change fate dice from whatever you want into a 6, which a normal Farseer can do. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. You're getting more in the beginning of the game, but you're getting less value over the course of the game, if that makes sense. So it's good, but is it as good as a Farseer's Branching Fates? I don't know. Time will tell on that one. Mind War is also okay. I don't think it's as good as Eldritch Storm, though. I really don't. I think it's going to be really hard to actually kill a character with this thing. It can threaten characters, but isn't likely to kill them. It only does d6 damage, and its AP value is not that great. Doom gives units a +1 to wound against a target within 18 inches, but requires line of sight. So that's good. Not quite as good as it was before, obviously, with the rerolls to wound, but it's decent. I think Eldrad is going to be solid, but not an auto-include. So if you do want more Farseers in your list and more Strands dice and you want to max your Strands dice, I think this is a really good way to do it with Eldrad. I just don't think it's necessary in every single list. But I still think he's a solid pick. Wraithguard are next, and Wraithguard got 1 extra toughness, 1 extra movement, and 1 more save, but they lost their Wraithbone form, so they're no longer negating -1 damage, which is fine. I think we've seen that basically lost on every single unit that had it anyway. And there's a reason for this. It's because units with -1 damage were really effective against weapons that would normally be good against them. And I think GW wanted to get rid of that feel-bad moment when you brought a lot of stuff to deal with heavy infantry, and then your opponent's heavy infantry was all of a sudden super resilient against your attacks, right? Like Shuriken Cannons into Death Guard, for example. Shuriken Cannons are normally really good against marine targets with toughness 5. Oh, guess what? Death Guard have -1 damage. Oh, guess my Shuriken Cannons are shit against them. I guess I better go with Scatter Lasers, right? It was kind of a feel-bad moment, and it created a lot of salty situations. So I do understand why that is. But Wraithguard lost that, but they did gain a toughness, they did get an armor save, so they did get tougher in a way. They also have very powerful weapons. The D-Scythe is nerfed, by the way. It's still strength 10, AP -4, damage 1. Doesn't have devastating wounds at all. It's just what you see is what you get. Doesn't have the blast keyword either, which is kind of weird. It's kind of like they nerfed the D-Scythe at the end of 9th edition because some GW employee thought it was OP for some reason. Thought, oh, it's OP. I lost against it in one of the games I played. I don't know what he was thinking, but D-Scythes got nerfed. And then now D-Scythes are even worse than they were in 9th edition. So obviously someone in GW really doesn't like the D-Scythe. But the Wraith Cannon looks exceptionally good. It has devastating wounds, range 18, strength 14, AP -4, and damage D6. That's great, especially with Strands dice. Again, because it has devastating wounds, you can use the Strands dice for it, for both the wound roll and the damage roll if you wanted to. So I think Wraith Cannons are the way to go with these guys. I don't think you take Wraith Sights, or D-Sights, I should say. But their special rule might change that a little bit, but in my opinion, not by much. And that is when something shoots at a Wraithguard unit, after those attacks are resolved, your Wraithguard, once per battle round, can take a shot at a unit within 18 inches or within range of your weapons. So that's why I'm really saying you should probably pick the Wraith Cannons, because if your opponent shoots you and then he has a tank within 18 inches of the Wraithguard, guess what? That tank is now vulnerable to those attacks, and you can use Strands dice on those attacks. So your opponent is going to have to make some really hard choices when shooting at these guys. And if you take the D sights, unfortunately, your opponent is just going to be too easily able to maneuver around their 12-inch range. So I really think the D sights are the losers in this in every way. And they don't even have the Torrent special rule, for God's sakes. So they're really just good against infantry, but we already have a lot of weapons that can deal with infantry fairly well. The other thing to mention is that they are now ballistic skill 4+. Their weapons hit on 4s, which kind of makes sense. They are Wraith units. They don't really see the world in the same way that regular Eldar do. They're not part of the living, so to speak. So they're a little bit less skilled. But hopefully a Spirit Seer will be able to change that. We'll have to just wait and see. So what do I think of Wraith Guard? So Wraith Guard, with their increased movement, toughness, and save, I think are pretty good. As far as their durability goes, they're faster than normal, so they can move quickly across the battlefield to get in better positions. They hit on a 4+. Again, hopefully Spirit Seers and Farseer SkyRunners can help out with that a little bit, giving them guide or perhaps a +1 to hit. The weapons are very powerful. The Wraith Cannon is insane, which I think is what you should be taking on Wraith Guard now. I'm really not impressed with the D-Scythe whatsoever. It does look good to a degree, but on a Wraith Guard, which you know is going to be expensive, I just don't think it's worth it, right? Lost the Blast keyword, lost the Mortal Wounds ability, and there's just weapons that can deal with infantry in our codex already. We don't really care about a high-powered, high-strength anti-infantry weapon that is really expensive, and we can get that elsewhere. Wraith Guard being able to shoot after being attacked once per battle round is also very good, and having the pistol rule while doing so is also a very good thing to have. All right, here we go. Avatar of Cain. So the Avatar of Cain comes in at toughness 12 with a 2+ save, 14 wounds, and objective control 5. This guy is a monster. His Wailing Doom shooting attack has sustained hits D3, which is going to make him good with Strands of Fate dice, especially since it's strength 16, AP -4, damage D6 +2. That's insane. Getting a lot of attacks out of this guy's shooting. As far as his close combat goes, he's obviously a monster in combat. Getting either 6 attacks, hitting at strength 14, AP -4, damage D6 +2, or getting sweep attacks, double the amount at 12, but hitting at strength 7, AP -2, and damage 2. So whatever you want to deal with, you want to deal with infantry, you got an option for that. You want to deal with heavies, you got an option for that as well. It's also one of the few models that has kept any damage reduction abilities. You half the damage that he takes, which is still extremely strong if you think about it. Half the damage that he takes. So basically he has the same special rule he had last edition, and that was very powerful in that edition, and it's going to be very powerful in this one. He has an aura as well that gives +1 to advance and charge rolls when made within units within 6. This includes himself, so he can get into combat a little bit easier. He does have the damaged ability, which means that he hits less when he's, below 5 wounds. And lastly, he has a 4+ invulnerable save. So I was not expecting this guy to be that tough. I was actually expecting a nerf on the Avatar of Cain, but he's extremely good. Toughness 12, wounds 14. He has a 2+ save with a 4+ invul and still halves damage dealt. He synergizes with Fate dice in both the defense and offense with sustained hits, D3 for shooting, and of course a 4+ invulnerable save on the defense. If you throw Fortune on him, you can get even better survivability, as most weapons will be wounding him on 6s, the stronger weapons will be wounding him on 5s, and the strongest weapons will still only be wounding him on a 4+, which is pretty awesome. He gets +1 to advance and charge rolls, which will help him get into combat. And overall, he has a great data sheet, and I expect to see him in several lists. Even if he's something like 300 points, I think he's still going to be a very solid pick. If you have the right support for him, that is. Okay, so I think that's all the units that are revealed. Again, if I missed any, please let me know in an email so that I can do a separate video on those units. As for our stratagems, I thought we lucked out with this, because not only do we have Fire and Fade, which allows us to move after shooting, but we also have this ability called Phantasm, which gives us a reactive movement in the movement phase of the enemy turn, and it doesn't have a range restriction. So basically, at the end of the enemy turn, we can select 1 unit from our army to move 7 inches, which is extremely good. It gives us a lot of versatility that we can use throughout the battle, and we can do some pretty awesome tricks with it as well, right? We can force our opponent to basically have to play mind games into thinking which unit we're going to move at the end of the movement phase. This is going to make our opponent's choices much harder. Blade Storm basically gives every 6 or critical wound that you score an additional -2 AP, which is a very powerful damage multiplier for only 1 command point. Obviously, this is going to be better on bigger units, but still pretty decent on smaller units. We have Feigned Retreat, which means we can do a fallback move and still shoot and charge potentially. Lightning Fast reactions allow us to get a -1 to hit on non-Wraith Construct units, which is a good durability boost. Matchless Agility gives us an auto advance 6, which is going to be useful for getting to objectives and things like that. And we have Fire and Fade, which we've already seen, but basically gives us a movement after shooting. And I have to say, this collection of stratagems seems very Eldar, very good. We have 2 that allow us to move after shooting, which is awesome. We have a couple that give us either a durability boost against shooting or the ability to boost our own damage as well. So I think we lucked out with this. I think we got a good selection of stratagems. All of them seem useful to some degree. More are situational than others, like Feigned Retreat, Matchless Agility, and Lightning Fast Reflexes are more of the ones that you will only see a couple times as they come up throughout the game, but still very useful to have. Our enhancements are also very good. The Weeping Stones allow you to get a fate dice for every unit you destroy with the character's unit, which is awesome. The Reader of the Runes allows your Farseer in the command phase to reroll a dice in your pool, potentially turning 1s into something else, better hopefully. Although I can already see situations where I pick up a 1 and I roll another 1. So that will happen. Fate's Messenger allows you to but make a hit roll, wound roll, or saving throw for a model once per turn into a 6, which is extremely powerful, especially on things like autarchs, which can potentially have, powerful weapons. The Phoenix Gem allows a model to revive on a 2+, which is also very strong. And you can give this to a Farseer SkyRunner or autarch to keep them alive and kicking for many more turns to come, potentially. So, yeah, I think these enhancements really synergize well with Strands of Fate. 2 of them giving you either Strands of Fate dice or allowing you to manipulate the dice, and 2 of them allowing you to manipulate rolls in the game or manipulate the survival of your characters. And yeah, overall, I think these are going to be really good enhancements. I think, if you're allowed to take 3 of them per army, I would probably myself take the Reader of the Runes, the Weeping Stones, and the Phoenix Gem. Fate's Messenger, I think, is good situationally on certain models, but may not be good for every model. But yeah, I think they're pretty powerful overall, and I'm excited to use them, especially the Phoenix Gem. So what are my overall thoughts of the reveals? I know that was kind of a long video, but to sum it up, what do I think about the reveals overall? So I think they're extremely good. The data sheets look awesome, and they feel all like different parts of a well-oiled machine. Even the more lackluster ones felt like they could be useful in an Eldar army. Each and every data sheet looks usable at the very least, or extremely useful and fun. The stratagems are really awesome, especially Phantasm and Blade Storm, I think are really cool. I'm really excited to use both of those. I think they're really awesome, especially Phantasm actually is my personal favorite. And the enhancements look really useful as well and synergize with Strands of Fate. I was afraid the enhancements were going to be garbage, to be honest, and I'm glad that they're not. I'm glad that they're actually decent. So, in conclusion, the reveals exceeded my expectations by a mile. Not only do most units feel unique and useful, but most of the changes were understandable. Again, except for Singing Spears and Witchblades. And I didn't really like the Wave Serpent change they made to the Serpent Shield, but again, you can't win them all. And I have to say, so far, it looks like GW put a lot of thought into most of the data sheets they produced for the Eldar, which is good because GW has a track record of not really caring about the Eldar too much. So it was really refreshing to see that they actually took the time to think about each and every unit that they produced and thought about new and unique ways to make them useful in games. And I'm really excited to play 10th edition and see more Eldar datasheets in the coming weeks. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's long video. Thank you so much for watching. I know that there was a period of time where I wasn't making videos this week and last week. I've been extremely busy with life, and this video was a project in and of itself, so I will get back to a regular schedule soon. Thank you to all of my patrons and supporters, by the way, for supporting the channel over the last months. Your help has greatly been appreciated. I will leave the links for my PayPal, Patreon in the description for you guys. So if you do want to support the channel, you can do so. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys next time, and I'm very excited to play the Eldar in 10th edition. Peace out, everybody. Have a good one, and see you guys next time.